You're listening to the Geek Saga podcast. This episode features audio of the ASOIAF fan panel that took place at San Diego Comic-Con 2022.
Everyone excited to be back after 3 years, Comic-Con? Yeah! I got a little bit too excited at Funko Fun Days, hurt my voice. Thankfully, I have three great panelists here that are going to help carry this. I'm doing a moderating role anyway, but my name is Amin. I'm from podcast Ice and Fire, and I'll let my panelists introduce themselves.
Hello, my name is Tara. I am the organizer of Ice and Fire Con, which was the first ever Song of Ice and Fire Game of Thrones convention in the US. And I also do a couple of podcasts. One's called Sagas and Sass. It's a genre-lit podcast where we cover one book series at a time. And I also have the Geek Saga podcast, which is where you'll be able to find the recording of this panel after San Diego Comic-Con is over.
All right. Oh. Hey everybody, I'm Aziz. I'm with the History of Westeros podcast. We cover the backstory and front story of The Song of Ice and Fire and Game of Thrones, and it's a full-time thing, and it's a lot of fun. We love talking stuff.
Hi there, I'm Michelle. I'm Aziz's co-host at History of Westeros, and I would like to say Ice and Fire Con is a lovely time. I recommend to all fans of Song of Ice and Fire. I like to call it Song of Ice and Fire Summer Camp.
Yes. It's a little smaller.
It's like 300 people.
Is there anyone that's here from our panel 3 years ago? Just I'm curious as everyone's doing. Okay. Well, I mean, we got House of the Dragon now, so that's something exciting, right? So that's what we're going to be mostly talking about, but Game of Thrones as well. Just put our names and just a little outline. This is the most text heavy we have. It's not that much, but we're going to talk mostly about House of the Dragon, and then talk a bit about residual Game of Thrones thoughts, and also the other spin-offs coming up. And then if we say anything during the panel, you have a question, come up ideally or put up your hand. We encourage questions during the panel and at the end as well. But we want to get the interaction here. We've got a good audience here. We want to take advantage of the panelists' knowledge here. So if you've got a question, come up or put up your hand and we'll get to you.
I highly suggest using the mic though, because especially if the noise from out there continues, it's going to be hard to hear you.
Right, and we want to record the question as well. Otherwise, we have to repeat the question every time. So ideally, just kind of line up. But if you can't make it up there or whatever, that's fine. Put up your hand. So with that ado, I'm going to let our panelists go into House of the Dragon. They're well versed. So everyone can tell us about House of the Dragon.
Well, you guys were in the panel today.
Yeah, we just came from Hall H, where we saw an extended trailer and about 11 cast members and the co-creator, Ryan Condal, George R. R. Martin himself. Unfortunately, Miguel Sapochnik, who is the other co-creator and who y'all might know as being one of the directors of Game of Thrones, got COVID and he wasn't able to make it to the panel.
Yesterday.
Yeah, too bad for that.
Yeah.
But as you can see, it is not created by the same people who made Game of Thrones, which I think is important to note, but it does have some of the same people involved behind the scenes, like Remy Jurati, who did the music, or David J. Peterson, who did the languages. So there's that connective tissue.
Yeah, and those are really important for creating the same vibe, using some of the same filming techniques as well, even if it's different people. In some cases, you want to have that feel. Like Star Wars has a feel, Star Trek has a feel, and if they're expanding this into a product fandom in the long run, well, they want to develop that. So this is such as the first expansion of the original. It's really important to establish that.
I think it's really exciting that in Game of Thrones, they really had very limited writers and very limited directors. And as you can see up there, they have a much larger writer's room where it's split 50-50, women and men. They've got the same for directors. And I think that's really important to show, a well-rounded story from multiple perspectives. So that's cool.
Now, as far as Ryan Condal goes as well, he was the first one brought on for this project. And David and Dan read the books, but Ryan was huge fan of the books, like someone who knows the world really well, unlike someone who read them and was like, this would be really good to make an adaptation of. So it's someone who's more involved, which we like to see that. Someone who knows the details better, someone who's not going to. If you all read the Entertainment Weekly article, there was a suggestion that they should change some names. He's like, we can't.
I was just about to bring that up.
Of course, then I later thought of the fact that some of the characters in the late part of the Dance of Dragons are named Kermit Tully, Elmo Tully. They might have to change Grover Tully. But Daron and 12 Aegons, we'll leave that because that's part of the feel.
Yeah, when they said they weren't changing names, I was like, yes, because I'm sorry, but it will never cease to annoy me that they thought Asha and Osha were too close, but then they changed Asha's name to Yara, which, isn't too close to Arya, apparently.
I think George said in the panel we were at in Hall 8, she said one thing he appreciated about doing House of the Dragon is that they had a lot more leeway to not underestimate the audience. We have something on our podcast we call the law of conservation of characters, where we understand that like sometimes for simplicity's sake they do have to do that. And he said that they really have been avoiding doing that for House of the Dragon because they're trying to be like, look, you guys aren't idiots. You can follow along. Like studios often underestimate their audience.
Yeah, and even people who don't maybe notice that there's been 3 different Grand Macers, which then they don't care. But people like us, we do care. And we're like, yes, that's great detail. We appreciate that. So yeah, it's in better hands. I think
well, I mean, and Ryan was basically handpicked by Martin himself.
Yeah, he was. Yeah.
So
he hired him. They had dinner together, and then George called him a couple years later.
And George went to visit him on set at a pilot that Ryan was working on. Was like, this guy seems like he might be able to do me justice.
And George himself now has a 5-year deal with HBO from 21 on to expand his world, which that wasn't in place before. He was more like a consultant, or I don't know exactly what he was, but he's a much more bought into the process now. So that's great too.
So out of curiosity, did they, in the panel today, were there any updates or changes to some of the things that have been announced maybe weeks ago, where I was reading one article and it said that they were only really planning on 3 to 4 seasons, and also that the Civil War arc is probably going to be like shorter than what readers would expect, which, I mean, the story that where they're starting in the Fire and Blood story it's not very long. It's a big chunk of that book.
Yeah.
But as stories go, it's what, a few hundred pages?
Yeah, out of like Fire and Blood is like 900 pages, I think, if I remember right. And
something it's like 3 or 4.
I think it's like, I think that's like a good, maybe a quarter of it.
But still, that's
like
shorter than one Game of Thrones.
Aftermath. Yeah, so there's exactly. Because they have so much to fill in. And one thing we thought that's kind of a funny thing to realize is the first season is going to cover like 28 years. And then the next season will cover probably a few months.
Yeah, it's like a 10-year time jump, right?
Yeah. In between episodes 5 and 6, apparently that's when the actors will switch, the younger versions.
They'll age up.
So,
as you'll see, I think on our next slide, we can move on and talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. And just a quick question for the audience. I'm curious, actually, so who has read like the written materials with House of the Dragon? And everyone else is going to buy it. So it's kind of a mix again. And that's my question for the panel. I myself, I enjoyed the written materials, but I'm not as attached to them as I was to the source books. And I feel like that might be the same for many people. It might help with the problem of like reading materials and then being disappointed with the show. I think it might actually help enjoyment of the show. But what do you think on that?
Yeah, that's a great point, because for one thing, they're not having to make their own ending. That's just by itself is enormous. But they also, in some ways it's better, in some ways it's worse. In terms of what makes it better, they have a lot of room to create and read between the lines. They have to characterize these historical figures. They have to give them personalities, and some of these are really good actors. Some of them are going to do a fantastic job of that, and we're going to see them in ways we had never imagined before. And the ones who do it really well, that's going to kind of overwrite our own. We're going to see that character from now on. And, when you go back and read the book, like, well, now I'm thinking of Patty Considine as Viserys. Especially, that's harder to do with Game of Thrones, because you formed more of an idea of who Tyrion was by reading about it. Because you got to hear his dialogue. You see him go have a drink and be with him on normal day-to-day activities. You don't have that with these characters. You have a maester writing about them years later, and that's the perspective you're getting. So that is what you're saying. There's so much room to build. They have to write the dialogue and all this other stuff.
They spoke to that a little bit in the panel this morning. They revealed that Emily Carey, who plays young Alicent Hightower, journaled a bunch to create the backstory for Alicent. That they gave the actors a little bit of leeway to really craft their character, because we don't really know that much about like Alicent as a child, or things
we really
like
know
that.
her mother's name.
Yeah. Can we now start a petition to publish the journal?
That would be
Release her notes.
Let's release the Alicent cut.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, Alicent's cut.
But yeah, as you can see there, we have They're doing kind of. I think a lot of people compare it to what they did with The Crown, where they recast actors and age them up. And so we do have that for some actors, for some characters, and not for others. Like Matt Smith is Daemon Targaryen the whole way through. Patty Considine is Viserys the whole way through. But for our female leads, Alicent and Rhaenyra, they will age up, as will a number of other characters.
Yeah, and to answer the other part of your question, as far as the idea that it'll be maybe 3 seasons of the Dance of the Dragons, and maybe they'll do other stuff, I think that is absolutely possible. It's going to depend a lot on how this first season goes. They're not even certain there'll be a season 2, but I mean at this point there will be. They just to make sure there's something. There's no reason for them to confirm it now. As you're a corporate executive, it's like we'll wait till we see the reaction and all that. But so they're going to expand so much, so many stories. There's 5 different scripts are being written for other shows that we know about. There's more than that though. There's more beyond that. They said that there's other ones. They just haven't leaked yet. So they're really putting the full court press on stories. And George has said that they won't all be about battling for the Iron Throne. But you have to set up the epic stories before you can sort of dial it back and be in the world, and kind of take your time more.
Well, I'll put up the list for you guys to comment on that. But before we move on from House of the Dragon, is there any questions for our panelists on House of the Dragon? Yeah, over there.
Hello, my name is Alan Elden, and I've been a fan of Thrones since it first came on. And well, I hate to break this to you, but are you familiar with the Blu-ray's history and lore of Game of Thrones?
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, I don't remember which season it was, but eventually they told the tale of the Dance of the Dragon, which is unfortunately the story of the House of the Dragon.
Oh, yeah.
Although it would be a little bit different in House of the Dragon, because what they showed in History and Lore is one maester's tale, whereas this is the objective, what actually happened. So there will be some differences.
In Fire and Blood, there are 3 different versions.
You're going to be changing what they put in History and Lore.
I'm saying that they're going to be choosing different interpretations based on, in Fire and Blood, there are multiple perspectives. There's multiple people telling the tale, and those stories conflict. So for House of the Dragon, they will have to pick an objective version.
Imagine a real history book. Imagine a real history book where there's or multiple history books. Like you have different coverage of the same era. 3 different authors writing about the Roman era. If they disagree on something, what do? That's what Fire and Blood is presented as, the book. There are 3 different, George writes in multiple sources that disagree constantly over what actually happened. The History and Lore doesn't get into that either, the video you're referring to. The show is going to have to make decisions on what actually happened, rather than presenting multiple different views. That's why it's different.
Well, and also, keep in mind, Martin is a lot more heavily involved with this show than he
didn't write
was with Game of Thrones. I don't know how much, if anything, he had to do with them.
He wasn't very involved in Histories and Lore. Like, for example, in Histories and Lore, the History and Lore is just incorrect because they show the Strong Boys. They show Rhaenyra's children as having, we lost our screen. They showed them as having blonde, silver hair, when in canon they have brown hair. So the History and Lore is actually incorrect, like, pretty definitively.
Yeah.
In other words, you've added more to it.
Yes.
Yeah, they've had to expand it. They've fill in the blanks. Yeah, there's a lot of missing stuff.
All right, consider me invested.
Cool. I think it's an interesting question. I mean, there is, as you say, a way to get around it, but like you could even ask, should they even feel bound by it? I mean, do they have to feel bound by it? But they have the reason to get around it anyway.
Yeah.
They don't need to feel bound by it because it's a history book, that they don't have to say that it was correct.
I don't know.
No one was there.
We don't trust those gray rat maesters anyway.
But I do remember like getting those different viewpoints. I remember like one was so sympathetic to this character, and I was like, oh, it's just about one person's spin on it, right?
You can see the bias. It's really written. George really tried to write it like real history is presented in our world, as if it was genuine, with all that conflict and things that probably didn't actually happen or missing details. Because I mean, if we look at our own history, I mean, real history books are like that. They leave out so much because those people weren't there.
Do we have one or two other questions here? So somebody put up their hand.
So as you've said, there are a number of characters that we really don't know much about, and they have to really flesh out, like Alicent, like Otto Hightower. Mm-hmm. Do you think they're going to lean into making some of these characters XDs from the Game of Thrones show, like Alicent leaning into Cersei, or Otto Hightower leaning into Tywin Lannister? for certain characters?
Well, for anyone who did read the Entertainment Weekly article about it, they spoke a little to that. Something that was really caught my eye, which was that the actors a lot of the actors auditioned with scenes from Game of Thrones. So, for example, older Alicent auditioned with Cersei scenes. Young Rhaenyra auditioned with Arya scenes. And I forget which some of the other ones were, but in terms of your Tywin comparison, they actually had an interesting comparison where they said Corlys was a little bit like Tywin, and Otto is more of like a Littlefinger type character, I think. Although I think you can see parallels between Otto and Tywin for sure, and between Corlys and other characters as well.
Yeah, some comparisons will be natural, others will be just like, you can kind of see vibes of this character here and there, and I think they'll want to do some homages.
Yeah, there's certain like archetypes that you hit in a lot of media in general, I think, where you have your mischievous girl, or you have your rule follower, or something like that.
And you always have to have ambitious types. It's a court. It's the center of power. There's certain aspects that just have to be present in some of these characters, if not lots of them.
I think that Otto too is actually more of a hybrid Tyrell. Like he's got a little bit of Mace and a lot of Olenna, right? Like which of course as a Hightower he'd probably hate to hear that he's like a Tyrell, but
That's lowly Tyrell.
Exactly.
What were the two colors? Was it the greens and the blacks?
Yes.
Which side do you support? Like when you
No.
Well, I can tell you that I've seen a lot of polls online, and the blacks destroy the greens. Like pretty much every poll I see is like 80% blacks to 20% greens. I do support the blacks kind of because I do think Rhaenyra had the better claim. But honestly, I'm team Gaiman Pale Hair, who is the child of two sex workers in Fleet Bottom King's Landing, Essie and Sylvena, and he had very progressive policies. So like if I were to say I want someone to be king, it would probably be him.
I have a feeling they're going to balance it out more from the TV presentations. She's totally right. In the book fandom, there's a huge disparity. Blacks are much more popular than the greens in terms of their claim. Not necessarily in terms of individual
characters. And that's
characters.
not really fun to watch. It has to be so one-sided.
Yeah, so I think they know that. If they don't know, well, they don't need to know that. They can just present it the way they want to present it balanced, I think. You're not going to love either side necessarily. You may agree with certain aspects, but even with like Rhaenyra is going to disappoint at some points and be great at other times, just like all people are. So
I think the fact that they're going to be showing Alicent and Rhaenyra's friendship, which is something that the book,
they were 9 years apart.
Yeah,
in the book. They were really friends.
Exactly. Like, so the fact that they're building that a little bit is, I think, going to make it's going to make everything have a lot more oomph when
I'm already heartbroken by the idea of like thinking about like their childhood best friends who grow apart, and like that's a really sad thing to think about for me personally. I didn't expect to feel so much without even seeing the show for the idea of like Alicent and Rhaenyra having a conflict.
You're looking at them and you're like, oh, they're getting along and their children are going to kill each other someday. But but that's what Game of Thrones does, right? You don't, without high stakes, you won't be emotionally invested. And even when we know that a lot of it's going to be tragic, there'll be some good moments too, though, I'm sure. Some uplifting moments.
If you have any further questions for House of the Dragon, please come up or put up your hand. I do have one more question on that, though. Is the greens, if I recall, is the Hightower side, right? That's And I mean, not to get too in depth with it, but it's almost like it's like the Andal's resurgence in a way because the Targaryens, because there are a lot of Andal families on that side, right? Do you agree on that?
Yeah, definitely. There's a lot of that older power or Andal or First Man power.
I think they'll be doing a lot with the faith of the Seven and that conflict with the Hightowers as they are from Old Town where the faith resides. I think that they will have a bit of a religious component to them.
Yeah, and the Greens, a lot of them were raised with their Hightower in-laws and raised at King's Landing, where a lot of the Blacks were raised at Dragonstones. There's definitely some different internal cultures going on as well, and with one house has all this Targaryen ancestry, the Velaryon ancestry, and so that's just more influential on their characters, and that's going to play. Whereas, like she said, the Seven, it's going to be more prominent. You saw how important the High Sparrow was. I don't think we'll have a character like that necessarily. Maybe we will, but they'll be really important. And they're more. This is an era where they're more powerful in the first place. Their power had dropped off over the years, especially as the Targaryens did too. So expect them to be a player in the game. Put it in terms that you're familiar with.
Is there anything else you wanted to cover on House of the Dragon, or should I move on to spin-offs?
Here's a question.
You look beautiful. beautiful, by the way.
Yes, great
I'm
costume.
Marjorie.
I can tell. Amazing. Amazing.
Lovely.
Thank you. Pardon me if I'm asking a question that's already been answered. I'm almost done with Fire and Blood, and I was wondering why they skipped to Dance of Dragons and why they didn't cover Aegon the Conqueror or Maegor the Cruel or even Jaehaerys the Conciliator.
I think because this story is the most fleshed out in Fire and Blood, and I think if it does well, it will enable them to tell some of those other stories.
Well, and there's also a built-in conflict, which showing not that there is no conflict, obviously, in the previous reigns, but with this one there is a built-in warlike conflict, and I think what they are probably assuming is people are more likely to watch this, be invested in it, be interested in it, because it is a little bit more similar to the formula that worked for them with Game of Thrones.
Yeah, with like the Conquest, for example, you would have, there might be conflict, but it wouldn't be, the war conflict would be pretty straightforward because they're just going to roll, steamroll the continent, and then they get mired in Dorne, and that might be interesting. But and then with Maegor, it presents the problem we described earlier, where you know who you're rooting for. You're not rooting for him; you're rooting for the other guys. That's right.
On note, they have said that with the name House of the Dragon, they have set themselves up to have a framework that after they do 3 or 4 seasons of the Dance of Dragons, they could go back in time and do Aegon's Conquest or even the Doom of Valyria. They brought up as an idea as a limited series, like part of House of the Dragon, but they'll jump around in time. So we might have that to look forward to.
George specifically joked around. It's like people probably wouldn't be that interested in just Jaehaerys building roads.
I would be.
I want to see Good Queen Alicent holding her women's courts. Damn it!
Well, speaking of spin-offs and prequels, you have the list up here. Is there anything that catches your eye? I mean, with regard to the snow, that's kind of going to the bottom of the barrel, isn't it? Like, what's going to happen?
In the words of Jon Snow himself, I don't want it. But
okay, so we can tell you that I also had the reaction. I was like, really? I don't know about that. And we happen to know people who were involved and who said when they heard about it, they were like, I don't want that. And then they read the treatment, and she was like, oh, this is pretty good. So I'm like, I still personally am like, I want all these other projects before I want the snow show.
Yes.
But I feel a little bit better knowing that someone I know and respect read it and was like, damn. And like George approved of it. Like himself, Kit Harington is the one who brought it to George and had this concept. So color me a little bit intrigued, but again, if you see, we have so many other shows that we could do that sounds so exciting.
And this is a good reminder, whatever, like any show, it's just the writing really matters probably more than anything else. If Snow is written well, we'll like it, period. Like, yeah, I'm like, I'm ambivalent too, but if it's good, it's good, right? There's no, that's what's going to determine how well it's written. So yeah, even if the initial idea maybe doesn't land with you, the writing could fix or destroy it if it's not, could make it like a total disaster. But it won't get made if it's probably that bad. But anyway, so that's how I kind of like baseline expectation. It's pretty hard to know until there's a script.
I mean, I'm really intrigued in the Corliss one because A, I love pirates, and B, like with the right treatment, there's some great pirate shows out there, Black Sails, and I mean, honestly, the original Pirates of the Caribbean movie, the first one was great. We don't talk about the others, but I mean, it will give them a chance to cast another, person of color in a great leading role, because they've already said it would be a much younger version of Corliss, and also for them to build George's world out, visually for us in, so many different areas and everything. Because how many voyages was it? 7, 9? 9.
Yeah.
Okay. Because I know it's behind my head, but
and there's more that aren't even announced that aren't up on there. So there's a few in development, and about that Corliss one, I'm particularly excited about that because we're talking about how important writing is. That one's being developed by Bruno Heller, who did Rome, and if any of y'all watched Rome, great show, short-lived, but he's got the chops, I think, to do something like this.
So the actor who played Marcus Antonius in Rome said that he joked with a couple of the other actors how they were like they wouldn't do Game of Thrones because it kind of stole their thunder, and they were joking. But now it's good to see Bruno Heller, the writer, involved in that. But yeah, so Tara's comment is really important there because expanding the world, they go to all these different places, And you're going to see, he's going to voyage to all these different places, and the fans will respond to certain locations. And it also gives them more chances to have a much wider, more diverse cast for all these different random places and create new creatures and sets and not just dragon imagery or wolf imagery or what have you. And yeah, what fans respond to has got a better chance of being the next show or something like that.
So if Corlys goes to YT, maybe they're more likely to greenlight the YT animated show that's in development, The Golden Empire. And I think that in House of the Dragon, we might see some of Corlys's treasures that he brought from these journeys, and so like we might see in the show him obtain those things as well.
Yeah.
I think the show I'm most excited about is 10,000 Ships, which is the story of Princess Nymeria of the Rhoynar, which also gets into the same thing of the Sea Snake show, where you get to see a lot of different locations and see the world.
And there's not a lot of overlap there. Like the places she goes are not really the places he goes.
Yeah, they go very different places, and I think the Nymeria story would be a very resonant story because it's a lot about like a refugee crisis is really what it's about.
Rather than explorer, yeah.
And rather than exploring. So I think it would be a heartbreaking show, and it's being developed by Amanda Siegel, who I have heard is apparently very on top of the lore, has been like, that she's like out of everyone but Ryan, that she's like been the most passionate about like getting things right. And
they'd have a real chance to start off with a bang, because, you know, the Valyrians destroy the Romish Empire. This is what starts this refugee crisis in the first place.
And if you're not familiar, the Rhoynar are the ancestors of the Dornish. The Dornish, Oberyn and all that, they are descended from Nymeria herself.
But they would have a bit of a retcon there as well. Didn't they remove them in Game of Thrones? Or they didn't refer to them anyways, right?
They referred to them, yeah. Okay. They just, part of the title.
They took the title away.
But the Dornish are still descended, and they did refer to, and Arya names her wolf after Nymeria.
Right. Oh yeah, I mean, she already exists.
So yeah, she exists.
Yeah. The sun is Dorne, the spear is
yeah.
Also, it's past time for them to fix how badly
Ex-Dorne.
they wronged Dorne in the show.
Yeah, they need to repave over that with some quality. You know?
Is anyone in the audience particularly excited by any of these spin-offs? Like, is there one that catches your eye? Which one? Dunk and Egg, yeah. I think that would encourage George to put more Dunk and Egg material, right?
Yeah. You would get to see another thing. That's another example of going to a lot of different places, but we get to see it from non-nobles, which is great. I mean, Egg is a noble, but he's not traveling around as one, except in extreme circumstances. But yeah, you see the gritty, like day-to-day, like sleeping under trees, rather than these stories have mostly been about the nobility. Even the POV, even in the books, almost every POV chapter is from someone who had a big head start in life.
Well, I mean, and logistically, they could even just make Dunk and Egg into movies as well. Like each of those novellas could absolutely be put into a 2 hour or 2 hour and 20-minute movie. Easily.
And they involve the Blackfire Rebellion as a backdrop, which is obviously one of the more interesting, fun parts of the Song of Ice and Fire history.
Personally, currently Dunk and Egg isn't on the docket as being animated, but I'm still rooting for them to pivot to it being animated, because I think that it really would do better that way, because Egg will age up. Young Egg Targaryen will age up too quickly for the events of the books, in my opinion. And casting Dunk will be a very difficult part. He's a very tall man. He's only 17 years old when the books start, and he's massive. That's a very difficult role to cast. But I could see it so easily animated, so I have a little hope for that.
Especially if it was the right animation style.
Yeah.
Don't give me Pixar. Give me Rankin Bass.
They did refer to the animation style that they've been working on for some of the shows as being akin to some stuff in Love, Death, and Robots, which is a gorgeous style. I'd love to see something kind of like Arcane and Into the Spider-Verse, like that kind of whatever that style that they use for that as well. But yes, I think there's a lot of ways they could go with doing different animation styles.
I think the only reason I wouldn't pick Dunk and Egg as the one I'm most excited about is because there needs to be at least one more Dunk and Egg story, if not have those stories be complete before they go to screen, because I've been burned once, y'all.
I wonder if what he's done, if the
he might
summaries for those are enough. He doesn't have to have them fully written, but you're right, I would want more as well. But
I would say probably for me, I do have Snow is the one I'm least excited for, and Dunk and Egg probably is second lowest for me, just because of that wild card element of it not being complete at all.
Do we have a question here? Yeah.
I, for one, am very interested in the Golden Empire. You mean, I've told you I've studied the history and lore as much as I can, but I can't recall ever hearing of this E.T.
Yeah, they're mentioned very little. It is mentioned right away in the first book in Game of Thrones. It's in Daenerys' chapter. It's referred to a lot, but it's between Valyria and Asshai. It's the nation in between there. It's large. It's Chinese. It's very much fashioned on Chinese history. We don't have a map with us, but we could maybe show you after. We could pull it up on the wiki. Yeah, it's very large, and it's on the other side of the great mountain. The great mountain pass that the Dothraki won't cross. It's on the other side of that.
Side of Essos?
Yeah, it's really far.
It's very far and very ancient. It's a very long dynasty. Just like real world China. Like it really is very modeled after China. I can do a plug for this. Actually, we did an episode recently on ET with Chris Stewart of the History of China podcast, and there was a lot more there than I thought going into the episode. I mean, it's like a 3-hour episode we did on this topic.
Got really big.
And then you wouldn't think that something like some fans have never heard of E.T., but we can talk for 3 hours about it.
Well, how many pages does it have in the World of Ice and Fire? Like one? Or is it just a blurb?
A little more than that. No, there's a little
It is
more
a couple
than that,
pages.
but
It's been a long time since I read it.
It's not long. It's not a long section for sure.
Got the World of Ice and Fire up there, I think.
Yeah.
But isn't it? Don't they have a
It's in
bunch
the Lands
of
of Ice
forts
and
there that are kind of like the wall? Like
That's a little past, a little north of that, but yes, closer to them than the wall is.
It was part of ET. Now it's not. So it's kind of like they probably built it, but they know the empire is fractured now, and there's like 3 different rulers currently, and there's been different times more than that. But it's a great setup for.
Yep, that's China, all right.
Yeah. And you got it. And it has it's got roads that are the second best in the world next to the Valyrian roads. So it's got one thing that's different about it in China is it's heavily jungled, so it doesn't have as much of the windswept barren. It does have that, but they don't control that anymore. That's the part they've lost.
Aztecs with it.
Yes, it's Chinese Aztecs. There you go.
Yeah, we have on here a bunch of the books. As we were talking about the World of Ice and Fire, and that's a beautiful book. If you're interested in history and lores, I do really recommend that in particular. Beautiful art all throughout it, and it's a great addition to your collection. Fire and Blood is obviously what's being adapted for House of the Dragon. So if you want to read the story, you'd be best served by picking up Fire and Blood. Although it is the tale of the Dance of the Dragons is told in the main series a bit. And in the Rogue Prince and the Princess and the Queen. There's a few places you can read about it, but your best bet is to pick up Fire and Blood.
Yeah.
Also, The World of Ice and Fire is a great looking book. It's a great coffee table book. And then when your normie family or friends come and visit and pick it up to flip through it, they get very confused. Personal experience.
And if you want to get really down with the maps, there's the Lands of Ice and Fire book, which was published before The World of Ice and Fire even. So it was our first look at some of the wider world of the Song of Ice and Fire. We were like, what's Bone Town? We've never heard of this. That kind of thing. And those are big. It's a map book where you pull out the maps and
unfold them.
Yeah, and they have Tyrion's travels where they show you everywhere that Tyrion went around the whole world.
Like a little arrow.
They have a city map of Braavos and of King's Landing. So that's also a great addition.
That's the only map where you can see where the Tower of Joy is.
And if you like cooking, get the cookbook.
Yes, I highly, highly recommend the cookbook. I made about 15 of their recipes.
Really?
Yeah.
I didn't know
15,
that.
nice.
But if you're total
What was your
noob
favorite?
at cooking, you need also a general cookbook because it's not for novices.
My favorite is I think it's called Dolor's Ed's chicken. It's like a roast chicken stuffed with oats and prunes and carrots, and it sounds really weird, but it is freaking delicious. I love Dolor's Ed, so I had to make it. And the quote that he says is "Don't trust a cook; they'll prune you when you least expect it." It's one of my favorite quotes of his. And so that was the first thing I made from there, and I probably made that 5 times just as a regular meal. It's so good.
So I have a couple of different potential questions for the panel, but also reiterate for people that came in, we're taking questions at any time. Ideally, if you come up to the mic so we can hear you properly. Any question related to Game of Thrones or House of the Dragon, please come up. Otherwise, we have some questions here, or if anything else the panel wants to discuss, I'll leave it open to the panel. But,
What do we have there?
Let's not bash Game of Thrones too much. We did that the 3 years ago.
Yes, we did. There was an article about it that has
We got some
since
questions
been
here. Here we
pulled
go.
from
Please give me a
the
second if
internet.
you're comfortable and your question.
Hi, I'm Alexander. I'm waiting for Winds of Winter. An AA meeting. My question is, there was a quote from George where he talked about how brand chapters are the hardest to write.
Yeah.
Because they're the most supernatural, and he usually refers to supernatural elements in very tangential or subtle ways. I guess I was wondering, how hard do you think he's going to go in the next book or two in terms of these supernatural elements? Like, how hard is Euron going to go? Is he going to ride a giant kraken, or is it just always going to be this mythical thing that we never quite see? Do you guys have any theories about that?
I do think we'll see a kraken.
Yeah.
I do. I think there's a lot of clues for that, and that's a pretty big mythical thing right there. So I mean, I think it has to the magic has been a pretty low level so far in the series. So I think by definition, it just has to be more magical. And like we've already started to get into that a little bit. And when he wrote the Melisandre chapter, for example, where we get a little more insight into that.
Yeah.
Well, and the glass candle is now burning when it wasn't before.
Right.
So the dragons hatching kind of awoke something that I think it's building up to. We're going to see a lot more magic. Now, is Euron going to ride a kraken? I don't know about that.
But I think a kraken will appear, and I don't know that it'll like really be. I don't think Euron will really have control over that.
Yeah.
No.
Like,
But
I think
Euron is dealing with sorcery and all sorts of and blood magic and stuff that the show didn't even touch on.
Do you agree that he's like a failed disciple of Bloodraven? Is that
That is
established?
one theory
That's a
that
theory.
it has some strong but incomplete evidence. But there's also just from quotes that he's given to characters early on in the series that haven't really come to play yet. Like Corin Halfhand says, like tell Mormont the trees have eyes again. We're living in an age of gods and monsters, and that hasn't fully formed yet. It's still in the process. Like I said, the dragons aren't even really grown yet. You've got prophecies coming true, lots of prophecies coming true, and that's gonna.
You like to call it a new age of heroes.
Yeah, it's the
sometimes.
second age of heroes, I think.
That we're seeing. Like, think about in 1,000 years from the events of A Song of Ice and Fire, how people in Westeros will remember what happened during this age. Like, it'll be so muddied and conflicted that you'll just hear like about Arya as like some mythical figure. You won't really know what happened.
Like, think of what Jon Snow really is, rather than the way he's been presented. You got to know him, and he gets all these things all the time. But if you look back on Jon Snow, he is Targaryen, Stark, Lord Commander, King in the North, undead, dragon riding. Like, that sounds insane, right? If you just were to read all that as a list, you would be like, who the heck is this guy? So it would sound really heroic and like this is like a beyond life type of larger.
Well, I mean, and Valyrian sword wielding too.
Yeah,
like
I mean,
that's
list
the
them all.
thing
Yeah,
that
you're right.
people
Like,
kind of like gloss over, but it's
so many things.
extremely important.
And he
that
had a pet
he-
wolf as well, right?
Yeah.
well, yeah. Why didn't you say warg? I mean, God, there's so many like skin
a very
changer,
super
dreamer. Yeah, like, you can't even name all his titles.
All right, we got another question here.
Hi, my name's Lauren. I started getting into Game of Thrones I'm one of the ones that watched the series, fell in love with it, and then just started reading up on lore because I found it super fascinating.
Nice.
So in terms of, I know there's a lot of big historical events, and one of the ones that I was super interested in is the Long Night. Can you tell me what specific historical events in the world are you kind of hoping that they're going to address in the future shows?
Ooh, good question. Well, there's certainly, beyond the ones that we've already covered, there's a few that we've maybe mentioned already that happened during the dance or that happened in the Targaryen era. But yeah, there's some, like the really early times where the children were prominent, the times of the first men. We almost got to see that in the Blood Moon show. That didn't happen. They were going to try to explore that, but they didn't have a strong knowledge of George's world, so that may have disappointed a lot of us if it had actually come to the screen. But something like that would be amazing. The Long Night would be a fantastic one because they would have to delve into why it's seen the way it is now, like where the seeds of the myths were born and these legends and what really happened. Do you guys have some ideas? I'm going to try to think some more.
You know those black monolith things that are everywhere?
Oh, the strange stone.
Yeah,
That'd be good.
That'd be
Or the Great Empire of the Dawn. You could do super far ancient
Very,
history,
very ancient.
pre-Long Night. So we mentioned Fall, Doom of Valyria, but you could also have Valyria well before the Doom and just have stories there.
Yeah, Apex, yeah.
Apex Dragon Riders and...
Yeah, we did bring up Nymeria, but that would definitively be my answer for a historical period. I would like to see the fall of the Rhoynar and their flight from the Rhoynar. They go through so many different... that would be my pick for a historical time period, but I would also love to see the Blackfire rebellions, which aren't written yet. Like, he hasn't fully written that out, so I want to see it, but I don't really, I want to see it when it's the right time to see it.
Yeah.
Yeah, you get more human conflict there. They have no dragons, no monsters, but more relationships probably than even House the Dragon would portray. Well, we'll see about that.
And I think a lot of people probably would like to see some histories for House Stark as well.
Oh, yeah.
Like that really, they other than the Snow Show, they really haven't, they aren't doing a lot with the North, and so I think doing something there would be good.
Yeah.
Any other questions from the audience? I can continue questioning, but this is your chance. If you want to dig deep, Game of Thrones, as you can see, or anything.
So if I ask another one?
Go ahead.
Yeah.
We're all talking about doing ones done in the past, but you think we're going to do any stories that happen after Game of Thrones?
Well, the Snow Show, if that one happens, that would be the first example. And if it works, then they'd be more encouraged to do more. But I think in the long run, yes, I wouldn't expect that. In the short term, I think that mostly they're trying to work with what George has already done. So before they go away from what George has already done, it just makes sense to stick with what he's done so far. And once they run out of that, then I imagine they'll entertain that more later. But
and there's also a lot of backlash from the end of Game of Thrones that I think that right now they don't. I've read some articles and it just really sounds like they don't want to admit that they screwed up and they know how badly they pissed off the fans, but they do. They'd have to be blind not to see it, and they'd also have to be stupid to think that the opinions of millions and millions of fans don't matter at all. So I think that it would be, other than the Snow Show, it's going to be a long while before they try to, if ever, before they try to move beyond what George has written.
And you've seen that in other fandoms. It's hard to do that. Like it took a while for even Star Wars to move forward. They mostly just did stuff in the past, and Lord of the Rings is starting in the past. Yeah, it is hard to move forward after such a big epic, because you're basing things around the world that's been built, and the world that's been built is what you've seen, and the world that's been built also existed a little bit before that. But what exists after this new long night, what exists after Daenerys and Jon and all that, it's difficult. Yeah,
but the other.
Regardless of how you feel about Bran becoming king or not, I can't help but to wonder what type of king he'll be.
You're right. It would be interesting to see how they, like having an omniscient, semi-omniscient, semi-immortal king.
In the Snow Show, that Jon would maybe interact with Bran at some point.
It could set up. That's how they could set up more. That's why the Snow Show is so pivotal. If it happens, it will enable them to drop hints of what other future stories could look like. Like you get Sansa for a minute and see like, what Sansa's doing, Bran doing for a minute. It's like, what happened to Drogon? Something out there. Like I don't know if you do a whole show around Drogon, but you could at least refer to the dragon. What's the deal with Drogon? Make it a comedy. Yeah.
I keep calling it the Snow Show, which really makes it seem like it's his talk show.
He just comes in and talks to you.
Like, what's new with you?
It's all very emo.
But talking about building, like promoting goodwill, like they put a lot of effort into the House of the Dragon experience here, and there's an app coming out that apparently you can raise your own dragon. Apparently.
Yeah. Has anyone here done the offsite, the House of the Dragon offsite?
Yeah,
we did too.
I'm supposed to be doing it this evening. Very excited.
Yeah, so we did the offsite, and you do get to hatch your dragon, and you get to name it and pick different eggs and colors. Like I've got a beautiful purple and pinkish dragon, and he's got a blue and black one. And they've got different horns. The app's very cool. The app will be launching on July 25th to everyone. Even if you don't do the offsite, you can get the Dracarys app, and it's like an augmented reality. It's kind of like it's not as interactive as Pokemon Go, but the same concept where like you put your camera and you can see it, you can feed your dragon, and your dragon will grow and stuff like that.
So it's a Tamagotchi.
Yeah, it's it's on the box.
yeah, there you go.
We've got 4 minutes left, so I'm going to let the panelists promote some of the things that they're involved in. Let's go into Ice and Fire Con first.
Oh, yay, there we go. So Ice and Fire Con was created way back in 2012. We had our first event in 2013, so next year is our 10th year. Now, granted, we did have to have 2 virtual conventions, but hey, whatever, it still counts. It's our 10th year running, so I'm very excited. We've got some really big things planned. As you can see up there, we've got this stuff over here. Westeros, an American musical. It's a Hamilton, Game of Thrones parody musical. It's so great. Funny. It's great. And then Queens is the new one that we did this year. It's a 6 and Game of Thrones Song of Ice and Fire parody musical. It's basically a love letter to the Song of Ice and Fire fandom, especially.
There's so many deep cuts.
It's super good.
Yeah, it's got some real deep cuts.
I mean, imagine Aegon Targaryen's using Tinder.
Yeah, it's that kind of thing. You can find them on YouTube.
Yes, yeah.
I can say that Tara was Cersei Lannister herself, and she was amazing. They were very good.
It's worth it for sure.
But yeah, and we'll be bringing Queens back to Ice and Fire Con next year. Like that's going to be one of our big programming things. We're going to be making it bigger and better. So I'm very.
Yeah, they've done their rehearsal.
That's what we did with Westeros. We have the cold cut, and then we have the finished product. I guess.
Let me tell you the kind of special things that can happen at Ice and Fire Con based on an event that happened this year. Every year they do a sword fight with fake swords, like plastic swords. It's really fun, like a melee. Everybody gathers and watches. Pool noodle jousting, right? That kind of thing. But then at the end, a man stood up and dueled another man. They had an epic duel, and he defeated him and named a Queen of Love and Beauty, and it was an actual real proposal. And yeah, that's you can't do that in a big place like this. I'm not sure. People wouldn't even notice. Are they doing a scene? Is that what's going on there? But all eyes on the con were watching this moment. It's great. So that's the difference between small cons and large cons, and so.
And there was David J. Peterson there this past year.
Yeah, so don't think you don't have big names still. Yeah. Oh, by the way, let me say something about him real quick. David J. Peterson, he wrote House of the Dragon will be the first ever TV show with a written language made by a language designer. You may have seen written languages from other shows and movies before. It's always the art department that makes those. It doesn't have consistency or not made by someone who has made languages before. So Game of Thrones, the original show, was the first ever show to have a language made by a language creator. And this is the first one to ever have a written language made by a language creator. And it's the same guy. So look for lots of Valyrian writing on things everywhere. And just that's part of the backdrop.
We've got
too exciting.
1 minute left. I'll just do our podcast real quick. I do podcasts of Ice and Fire for Game of Thrones and House of the Dragon and Bastards King's Raid for anime, manga, that kind of stuff. And then the last minute, I'll let Aziz and Ashay talk about their podcast.
Yeah, we do History of Westeros, as you can see. We will be covering House of the Dragon every week, and then we'll be back to covering, we've been going through the world of Ice and Fire, as I mentioned, and then we'll see what we do after that.
Yeah, we've been doing that for about as long as Ice and Fire Con's been around. And
10 years now.
We do live streams every week and scripted content with art and visuals and people reading quotes and stuff like that. So it's a good time. If you're into the lore, we're a good option.
Perfect. And the last thing, if anyone plays the board game, we have a survey for that. We're trying to do a tournament for that. But otherwise, thank you so much, panelists, and thank you, audience, for coming.
Hope to see you next year.
Thank you for listening to the Geek Saga podcast. If you like what you heard, please check out other Geek Saga entertainment endeavors, including the Sagas and Sass webcast and podcast and Ice and Fire Con.